Hey now, my name is Nick, this is Board Game Brawl, and today we're going to take a look at a game that is currently seeking funding on Kickstarter called Clockwork Kingdom. This is from designer Brandon Allen and publisher Mr. B Games. And if you're interested in the project, I'm going to have a link floating around here somewhere that's going to take you directly to the official Kickstarter page, as well as another link down below in the comments. Now, Mr. B Games is a fairly new company, but the games that they've put out so far have all got one thing in common. They're very thematic, and you can tell just by reading the titles. You have Alien Uprising, Spurs, A Tale in the Old West, and now Clockwork Kingdom, which, as you might have guessed, has a very rich steampunk theme. In the game, you are all candidates for the throne. The king has just died, and you are a noble in this steampunk magical world, and you're trying to lead your little army of automatons and alchemists and artificers and try to take control of the throne. But of course, the other players are going to try to stop you. They have armies of their own, and they have their own resources. Mechanically speaking, this is a worker placement game with a few neat, innovative twists. So I'm going to show you a brief overview of the game, and then we're going to come back and I'll give you my final thoughts. Okay, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of Clockwork Kingdom. Now, a few things I want to stress right off the bat. First off, this is a game that is currently seeking funding on Kickstarter. So if you're interested in supporting it, you can go directly to the official Kickstarter page by clicking on the link that's floating around somewhere on your screen and also down in the comments section. Also, please note that obviously this is a prototype version of the game since the final project has not yet been released. So some of the artwork and components and even some of the game mechanics may change in the final version. And finally, I will tell you that this will not be a thorough rereading of all of the rules. If you want to read the rule book, you can actually go to the official Kickstarter page and download the rules for yourself. This is just going to be an overview to give you a taste of what the game is about. And what is the game about? Well, this is a competitive game for 3 to 4 players that takes place in a steampunk-influenced fantasy world. The king has just died, and you play one of the nobles who is trying to gather your army of automatons and intellectuals in order to take control of the throne for yourself. But obviously, the other players are trying to do the exact same thing, and they will try to thwart you while trying to gain control for themselves. Now, at the beginning of the game, each player is going to get some of their different bits in their own color. So, for instance, most of the bits that you'll take are going to be these workers, and a lot of them are just automatons. This is a worker placement game, but some of them are actually special. You have the alchemist, and you have the professor, and you have the artificer. And you've only got a few of each of these special ones. Mostly what you have are automatons, but you'll get all the workers of your color. And you're also going to get some cards representing your little resource mats here and your little storage section. Once everyone gets all of their bits, you're going to roll for turn order, which is actually going to mean that you're going to put one of your automatons on this section of the board, which is section 8, the King's Park, which will determine turn order and some other little bonuses, which we'll get to in a minute, and then the game will begin. Now, the easiest way for me to explain the gist of the game is to go through what each different area on the board signifies when you place your worker there. For those of you that don't know, in a worker placement game, you put a pawn representing your worker on a space on the board and get a special power, and Clockwork Kingdom is no different. So let's go through each different area on the board, and then we'll tell you what they all do. Okay, space number 1 is the market. This is where you're going to get resources, which you're going to use in order to build a lot of the different steampunk technology and therefore get victory points for the end of the game. When you put one of your workers in one of these spaces, you're going to get the corresponding resources. You have steel, canvas, lumber, and copper, and you have little cubes that will correspond to each of those. So when you take one of them, you're going to put them on to one of your little cards here, your storage shed, and keep track of those components. Now, you also have some random spaces here, which may or may not be in play depending on the number of players. If you go there, unfortunately, you're going to have to settle for taking one of the a resource at random. Now, this is where one of these special workers comes into play, because you can actually use your alchemist by putting it into one of those spaces, and no matter what space you put it into, you're going to get a resource of your choice. But even if there are no spaces remaining, because this is a worker placement game and the spaces may fill up, you can still put the alchemist over in that general area and take a random resource anyways, which makes the alchemist quite powerful. Now, let's move on to the second area. And speaking of alchemy, let's talk about area number 2, the Alchemy Lab. Now this is one of the contested spots in the game, which is to say that during the resolution phase, whoever has the most workers here is going to gain the benefit of it. So there's no specific spots here. You can theoretically trudge in as many workers as you want. In this case, what you get for having the most workers there and therefore the most influence are these little Alchemy Stones. Now why are Alchemy Stones good? Well, that's because you get to put them on one of your little resource cards here, and they will actually count as whatever type of resource you want when you're trying to build things, which can be very, very critical. There's one of the resource cards. So you see if you put it here where it says copper and steel, it become either copper or steel. If you put it on copper or canvas, it can be either copper or canvas, and so on. So it's a very powerful item to get. Now, this is another spot where your alchemist can come in real handy. If you want to put your alchemist on that spot specifically, and you happen to win that area, instead of getting just one alchemy stone, you're going to get 2 as well. They still only count as 1 worker, but it can help you get even more stones. Now, let's go on to the next area. The next area is the workshop. That's area number 3. And this one does actually have specific spots, numbered 1 through 5, for workers to go. However, it is still a contested area. Once it's resolved, you're going to resolve them in order. And a worker that you have there is able to do one of 2 things. You can either take a schematic card from one of that you have up here at the top of the board to put it into one of your 2 spots that you have in your what's quote-unquote yard in order to hold schematic cards, or you can build an incomplete existing schematic that you already have in your yard. Now, schematic cards are important because they're going to give you victory points and perhaps special powers during the course of the game. At the beginning of the game, there's always going to be warehouses that are available to build. Everyone can only have 1 warehouse, hence there's going to be 4 available to build from. And whenever you build any kind of schematic, you're going to have to give up the appropriate resources that are indicated up here at the top of the card. When you do that and you build this, you're going to get +2 storage. Now, the rest of the cards, there's a lot of different ones, but here I'll just show you a few. You have the telescope, which means you can choose an opponent's schematic that costs 4 or fewer resources. This card now counts as that schematic. Another one is the excavation golem, which lets you get +1 ruin card per round, and we'll get to the ruin cards in a minute. And note that up here are the victory points that the card is worth. You have the college, which is going to give you +1 professor per round. And you have the Colossal Blimp, which takes a lot of cubes, which is worth a lot of points. You can have any number of completed schematics. Now, here's also where some special workers are going to come into play, because if you play one of your artificers down into that spot, you're going to be able to reduce the cost of one of the schematics you're trying to build by 1 of your choice. If you use the professor, however, that can be even more powerful because it allows you to do both a build and take action. You get a schematic card and you're able to build one that you already have. Although you can't double up on either of those 2, it just lets you do both actions independently. So that's area 3. Let's go on to area 4. Now, area 4 is called the Ruins, and anytime that someone puts a worker there, they're able to draw one of the Ruins cards. Those are also called action cards, and they're one-time use actions you can use whenever they're appropriate, and you also cannot exceed the 4-card limit that you have for your hand of cards. Here's a few examples. You have the King's Crown. Let me focus that there. Which says that you can place an automaton not in your pool on the first space in King's Park. If the space is occupied, move all workers down 1 space. If you already have a worker in King's Park, discard that worker. We'll come to why that's important in a little bit. You have the Gears of War. On your turn, you may move 1 of your tokens on a battlefield to any other battlefield. And Resourceful. On your turn, take 2 random resources from the supply. And Spare Parts. At the beginning of your turn, before placing a worker, add 2 automatons to your worker pool. So that can be very important to get a little edge over your opponents. Now let's go to the next area. Now, area 5 is the biggest area on the board and also the most contentious. What it actually is 4 smaller areas called battlefields. This is called the Battle for the Kingdom. When you choose to take this action, you're going to put one of your workers on any one of the 4 battlefields around the corners of the board. You have Capital Skies, the Temple of Vapori, the Sea of Vern, the Pinionopolis. Now, not all of these areas in every worker space are going to be available in every player count, but when they are available, you can put one of your workers there. Now, for a lot of the game, this isn't going to matter too much. However, during the 3rd, 6th, and the final round, the 9th round, and by the way, there is the round track up here. When those rounds come around, so to speak, you're going to actually look at who has the most influence in each of those areas, because this actually represents you battling for the kingdom. Whoever has a majority in each of those areas is going to score points depending on whether they're in 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th place. Now, Area 6 is the university, and this is actually where you're going to get more workers of all the different types. You don't start off with your entire allotment of workers, whether it's even automatons, professors, artificers, or alchemists. Instead, you're going to have to acquire them and train them from the university. And the farther you are along the track, the more powerful your workers are going to be. Starting off with a professor, then the artificer, then the alchemist, and then finally the last two spots are automatons. So the sooner you get there, the more powerful a worker you're going to get. The factory is another area where the more workers you have there, the better, because it's a war for influence. Whoever has the most influence there when everything is resolved is going to get the top card off of the production facilities. And the production facilities are going to be cards that will give you permanent bonuses. So for instance, the copper smelter will give you +1 copper per turn. And you'll find one of these for each of the different resources. And this is another area where the artificer is really going to help, because every artificer there for your faction is going to count as 2 influence. And finally, the last spot is number 8, the King's Park. This determines turn order at the start of the game, but it's also going to determine it during the course of the game. The sooner you can get there, the faster you'll go on your next turn, and you're also going to get a special bonus. If you're the first player, you're not going to get a bonus, but other players may get something as a little reward, like being able to draw a card, draw 2 cards, or pick 1, draw 3 and pick 1, or draw 2 cards. And that'll determine turn order each and every game. And if you don't put your workers there, you actually put resources there, which will be a bonus for later people that are going to come there and take the spots anyways. So that's really just a very brief overview of Clockwork Kingdom. You're trying to put your workers out, gain the most resources in order to build schematics, maybe fight for the kingdom. You're going to get points just for building schematics, fighting for the kingdom, resources that you have left over at the end of the game, and whoever has the most points at the end of the 9th turn is going to be the winner. Now let's get back to my final thoughts. Well, there you have it. That's Clockwork Kingdom. And while it might seem like your typical worker placement game at first, I think that Clockwork Kingdom does some things that are very innovative that, surprisingly, even in this day of age, a lot of worker placement games simply don't do. Chief amongst them would be the idea of having workers that actually have special powers. Yes, you have your automatons, but you also have your alchemists, your professors, your artificers, and you have to strategically place them on the board in order to get the most out of them. And because they're a limited resource, unlike your automatons, you have to know when to hold them back and when to place them. Putting the alchemist down on the board in order to get the alchemic stones, you know, I think that entire concept of these special workers ties very closely to one of the other different things about this game, and that's that the theme really is integrated well into the components and the game mechanics themselves. I would say foremost is the idea of building things. Now, I'm not intimately familiar with the steampunk culture, but I know that at the heart of it is actually building things, building these steam contraptions and devices, and that's a huge part of this game. You're building these schematic cards, and you know, mechanically speaking, you're just getting victory points from them, but because they are all these cool steampunk technologies, it makes you feel like you're actually part of this steampunk world. As is having the automatons and these workers that go around and do different things and try to gather resources. So you have these mixing of these elements, like the thematic elements of the steampunk genre mixed with Eurogame elements, which seems to clash at first, but they actually go together quite well. Now, the other thing is the battle for the kingdom, which is it's another very different thing about Clockwork Kingdom, in the sense that most worker placement games and Euro games don't have a lot of direct conflict. And I guess that you could say, just from glancing at it, that it doesn't look like direct conflict. I mean, you're not rolling a lot of dice and battling with each other, but in fact, it's a very tense situation where you're trying to gain majority of these different areas and trying to score victory points, and it's something that's worked out over time, so it doesn't feel like a pressing threat at first, but when you're getting to those rounds where you're going to do the scoring, then it can feel, you know, very, very tense. So that's another way in which Clockwork Kingdom sets itself apart. And I think that's where this game is going to fall. It's going to be one of those games that sort of changes your perceptions of how a worker placement game is going to work, so to speak. So who is this game for? I would say that if you like worker placement games, obviously, I'm typically one of those people, I think that this one is not just another worker placement game. I think that it sort of sets itself apart significantly from other entries in this genre. I also think that if you're a steampunk fan, there seems to be a lot of steampunk love within the board gaming community. This is definitely one to keep your eye out. Most of the steampunk games that I see coming out, especially from Kickstarter, are lighter card games, and they may have beautiful, gorgeous art, but that is the only way in which the steampunk theme really comes through. In this case, you actually have all of these steampunk elements coming out through the mechanics themselves. And when something like that happens, no matter what the theme is, I think that's something that you should pay attention to. So if this seems like it's up your alley, you can go ahead and check out the official Kickstarter page. The campaign is running now as of the time of this video being published. I'm going to have a link floating around here somewhere, and then down in the comments section there will also be another link, and you should consider pledging to the campaign if it's something that interests you. My name is Nick, this has been Board Game Brawl. We took a look at Clockwork Kingdom from designer Brandon Allen and Mr. B Games, and I'm reminding you to get out there and game every day and in every way. Take care.